Yes.
Thank you.
I'll just
workshop on high carbon sectors to climate jobs, making it real. So the idea here is that we are looking at, there are alternatives, some really significant alternatives to the climate, cost of living, inequality crisis in our society. But in some sectors that are more carbon heavy, or that are very carbon heavy, there are challenges which are, on lots of different levels in terms of, within the trade union movement, what does it really mean to transition? Is there any traction with that slogan, or does it feel like empty rhetoric? There are important campaigns, anti-fracking, against oil and gas, against burning trees. How do those campaigns orientate themselves to support workers' rights, good jobs, etc., and do that in a way which doesn't, which can actually make some headway. So that's kind of roughly the idea of what we're talking about here. Do feel free to take it in any direction that you want. But I'm going to introduce the list of speakers. We haven't actually agreed on an order, so I'm gonna take people in the order that I read out their names. But if you want to change that order, just send a message to me in the chat, or just say so. It's good to see all of you here, and we have until 12:45 for the discussion as part of this workshop. So in order, Pete Cannell is involved with Scotty 3, which is a campaign organisation based in Scotland, and has done a lot of work on energy transition from a workers' rights perspective, particularly focused on North Sea oil and gas. And there's a lot more to the work of Scotty 3, but I'm sure Pete can fill in whatever the missing gaps that I'm leaving out here. We have Dr. Joe Cutter, who's an academic and activist based at Leeds University, and does work specifically on industrial transitions and trade unions. And welcome Pete, welcome Joe. Both are colleagues and activists and comrades that we have worked with in campaigning against climate change, and have really important, interesting things to say. Stuart Boothman, who is part of the Just Transition Wakefield group, and a number of other things as well. And this is of relevance because the area in which Stuart is based is definitely an area in which there are a whole number of high carbon industries in Yorkshire and the Humber region, and therefore there is that specific challenge that we spoke about at the start of this workshop. And we also have with us today Mary, I'm really sorry I don't know your surname, stepping in for Katy Brown as part of the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, and doing particular work around drax in the Yorkshire area again. So welcome, Mary. I'm just thinking, actually, I'm actually going to change up the order. So if we do take Pete and then Joe, and then perhaps if we go to Mary and then finish with Stuart, I think that might work a little bit better than the order I've read it out in. Okay, we've said about 7 minutes for each of the intros, and then we'll go for as much participation discussion as people would like to do. So Pete, can I bring you in first?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Suzanne said, I'm going to talk about some of the issues around transition in the North Sea and what that means for oil and gas workers. It seems kind of appropriate to be talking about this on the morning when the UK Climate Minister has just announced that increasing production of oil and gas from the North Sea will be beneficial for the environment. I mean, quite clearly, that's magical thinking, but I guess quite a few of the people in the workshop will be familiar with the survey that Platform did a little while ago. Um, Something like 1,500 oil and gas workers who were asked about what they thought about transition. Very, very few of them had heard about the idea of just transition. But on the other hand, a very high percentage of them would leave the industry like a shot if they thought there was a realistic chance of employing their skills in renewables and in a kind of in different activity that would be sustainable in the future. And I think that's a really important starting point to think about transition, because part of what has created that kind of environment where, apart from a brief flourishing of activity post the Piper Alpha disaster, when for a moment oil and gas workers really organised through the Oil Industry Liaison Committee. Uh, Otherwise, the story of North Sea oil and gas is that it's acted as a trailblazer for neoliberalism for yeah, most of its lifetime, and led the way in implementing practices that have become widespread elsewhere. But were often it was one of the early implementers of them. So there's been a concerted attempt to atomize the workforce, and a really strong kind of ideological position that the market's sacrosanct. Although when you look more carefully, what you see is that, in fact, over the lifetime of the North Sea, the amount of money that the big oil companies have received in subsidies from the state, paid for by us through taxes, actually far exceed the taxes that they've paid. So they talk about the need for the private sector, but in fact it's an incredibly highly subsidized operation. Now, in her recent, the Tory conference on trust trailed that what their policies are going to be is more oil and gas, more nuclear. Didn't talk so much about hydrogen, but that was part of the hydrogen for heating was part of the whole agenda. And in fact, rather than this being anything new, it's a doubling down on the energy security plan that the Tories published back in the 6th of April. And the emphasis in that plan, particularly in terms of where major investment goes, is, as I said, around nuclear, hydrogen, oil and gas. And it's a disaster for the climate. We could go into that in discussion why each of those would be so. But it also implies very high costs for energy. Both nuclear and hydrogen and oil and gas are very high cost options. So, any idea that they would be some kind of solution to the cost of living crisis is just nonsense. And the costs associated with the policies that they plan are much higher than would be the case for renewables. And it's also a disaster for jobs. Probably the best kind of evidence for this is the Sea Change report, which was...
Pete, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but there's quite a few people indicating that you're quiet. Is there any chance of raising your volume?
Okay, I'll try talking louder. I think that might be the only way of doing it. Is that any good?
Or closer to the microphone.
Yeah, I'll be. I can't get any closer to the microphone, I don't think. So I'll just have to try talking much more loudly. Okay. So yeah. So the Sea Change report made it very clear that the preserving the status quo would mean a continuing decline in employment, whereas transitioning out of North Sea oil and gas production into renewables would mean really significant increases in employment across the board. So you know, this strategy that the Tories are adopting is totally aligned with the North Sea transition deal, which they've made with the big oil and gas companies. But it's important to say that it's not just signed up to by Westminster, but also by the Scottish government and by the unions who represent North Sea oil and gas workers. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to really bring these connections out much more clearly, because I'd argue that while energy policy and investment is guided by this so-called transition deal, and as long as unions are tied into this really what in the long term is a grotesque partnership, oil and gas workers won't be convinced that a just transition is possible. And so it's really important that we campaign around making it impossible to start new oil and gas fields, particularly gas fields at the moment. So, the Stop Cambo, Stop Rosebank, Stop Jackdaw campaigns have been really important in bringing people's attention to that. But they are, those fields are only part of a whole string of others that are in the kind of pipeline of what's being planned. And I think we have to, as a movement, actually stress the interconnections between this and the need to break the transition deal, because that's what's driving these developments. And in doing that, I don't think the power to do that will come from across the movement, across the trade union movement. I don't think it will be led initially by oil and gas workers, but I actually think that they don't live in a world that is separate from the rest of us. That if we can actually grow that movement, make it very, very clear what the connections are and what the alternatives are, and I guess that's what we're going to be talking about in much of the rest of this session, then I think oil and gas workers can really come into their own, because then the desire to change that industry, to bring it to an end, to phase it out, when they start seeing that there really is serious power behind the movement to change it, that there's a serious plan, that there's opportunities for retraining, when all of those things start to emerge, then I think oil and gas workers will come into their own, and they will actually start to believe in just transition. While unions at the top are tied into the transition deal, I don't think that's possible. So I think that's one of the reasons why in Scot E3 we've put a lot of time into trying to expose those connections. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And that may be something that we want to talk about, because certainly at the top of certain parts of the trade union movement, there is support, overt support for new oil and gas exploration. So not simply question marks over whether transition can happen, but actually no challenge to continuing to move in that direction. That isn't across the whole of the trade union movement, and I think that's important as well. And then also, I suppose that does connect us nicely to Joe, because sort of building on that, what those people who work in high carbon areas, what are they asking for? What are their thoughts and debates and discussions taking place, which is kind of quite a lot of the work that Joe has done. So Joe, if I can bring you in, I was happy to elevate you there to Professor earlier on, but welcome Joe.
Professor, but thank you for
I'm happy to do that. So Joe, welcome, and let's hand over to you. You have about 7 minutes, Joe.
Great. I'm going to share some slides, if that's all right. Everyone else has been brilliant to be speaking without them, but I need my props, so I hope you don't mind. Can you see any slides? Sometimes they're a bit slow.
No, they're there.
Oh, I can't see them. That's weird.
Can others see them? I can see them definitely, Joe.
I'm not sure if we can see your background, actually. Joe.
I've got some green fields.
Green fields, yeah.
I don't know if you need to give me some permissions or anything. Let me just try again.
I can see green fields. Can others indicate if they can see green fields?
Oh no, you're supposed to be able to see some. Oh, there.
Pete, can you
see
can
some
people
slides?
stick their thumbs up if they can see green fields? Now, if they can see slides. Yeah, okay. I think people can see. Thanks, Nikki. Tina, thank you.
Okay, great. So you've got my slides there.
Yes, great. I think we're good to go. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks. Yeah, this is me working with colleagues in Leeds. So I'm just going to show 2 or 3. This is quite a large survey that we undertook last year. We have actually done a recent update, but we're still looking at the data. So some of the more, I think, more recent issues around the energy crisis and some of the points that Stuart was talking to, I think, may come from this kind of more recent data. But really just to explain where this comes from. It's not just specifically about oil and gas workers. We've been talking to, we had a survey, a representative survey across the UK of all workers, representative regions, age, gender, actually ethnicity, focusing on those who are economically active, so people in work or seeking work. And just I wanted to show some slides here today of thinking about how do the responses from those in higher carbon sectors, so a definition which broadly includes people in energy sectors, the parts of manufacturing which would be seen sort of heavy intensive users that kind of need to transition more in terms of decarbonising with other workers. Now, I do not want to set higher carbon workers against the rest. This is purely a kind of an exercise in thinking about what do we understand the perspectives of these workers compared to kind of others. We also looked at the data in terms of how union members see these things, but in terms of my slides, I'm going to focus on the higher carbon ones today. We reported at the beginning of the year, specifically looking at this data in relation to workers in Yorkshire and Humber to feed into the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission. So if anybody's interested in that report, I can certainly put a link into it in the chat later on. Okay, so we wanted to look at how workers perceive a starting point, perceive the climate challenge. And why did we want to do this? Is because, as was just mentioned, there's been lots of dialogue around just transition, and we need to have strategies. We need to think about the design of those policies. We need to lobby government for that. Dialogues around green jobs, but very little data in terms of how workers actually see these challenges and how they view them, what they think the prospects are for their own work and skills. Do they have hopes and fears for these transition? And whilst our group that I've just mentioned, we're kind of much more naturally qualitative researchers, we're much more likely to do research with, and indeed are doing research that talks to workers directly. Nevertheless, now and again, a survey is helpful to kind of have a bit of a stock take of some of these things. So the starting questions was about kind of concern. So are you concerned about climate change? Do you think they're being felt now? And do you think we should act urgently? And what was really interesting is to see that level of concern is broadly the same across all kinds of workers, but this kind of view on what, the sort of sense of urgency or the sense of the sort of the effects. Clearly, if you think the effects are lower, then your sense of urgency to act is different. So that's an interesting conundrum, and one that, in terms of the, if you like, the academic work that we're doing, is trying to look at what might be sort of underpinning some of these differences in opinion. But perhaps more interestingly, we all then wanted to come on and think about how do people see the prospects of transition, notwithstanding all of the things that have just been made in terms of what transition. In fact, we seem to be, going backwards, but nevertheless, stay with me in terms of this notion of if we are going to transition, how do people see that? Now, workers in higher carbon industries actually feel quite positive in terms of the overall benefits. So we asked the first set of questions, which is about how does this affect, or how these changes might affect your community. And given that workers are often in locations in high carbon sectors, particularly when we were looking at the deep dive in Yorkshire, as you might imagine, in locations where there are also the emergence of some greener industries, then the prospects seem positive. Less overall positive about the job quality, which again is clearly an important concern and demand. But when we ask the same workers about how they think this transition might affect them directly, clearly workers in the higher carbon sectors feel that there is a distinct possibility that they will need to change jobs. There's much more likely to feel that they'd need to reskill, possibly relocate. And again, the sort of the prospects for better quality jobs are sort of slightly more optimistic, but again, still not great, still not huge. So in terms of just putting some of that in context, we also wanted to ask workers about whether, if their organisations are decarbonising, whether they're involved in dialogue at the workplace, or whether they've been informed, whether they've been taken part in any training in that regard. So we had this kind of overarching question: has your organisation made any changes to try and reduce carbon emissions? Quite a lot of people not sure. And certainly one of the most sort of depressing aspects of this sort of set of questions was when we asked those who were in those workplaces where there's some kind of decarbonisation strategy, it might be called lots of different things, but where there's some kind of plan. We're not commenting on those plans, we're just looking at the nature of dialogue around them. Very few workers have been involved in consultation about them, and even less, even in those higher carbon sectors where, in a sense, on paper, there is lots of exciting things going on in terms of decarbonisation. Workers just really not involved in those debates. How am I doing for time, Suzanne?
You have got 1 minute left.
Okay.
Let's make it a little bit flexible. But
okay, I'll scoot through. I've only got a couple of more sort of important points that I wanted to make.
Yeah.
So we did ask workers about what they would like to see in a just transition, and given these kind of concerns around needing to change jobs, lack of kind of relevant skills that they felt were relevant, lack of access to training around these challenges, as you might expect. Sorry, this isn't on this slide, but there was another set of data which is essentially, in terms of the kinds of provisions that unions are often demanding, access to training, support to transition, are absolutely key in that. There are other measures which are more applicable for some, that may be more about sort of, the link to possibly pension boosts if people are to retire early and so on. But training was absolutely at the centre of the kind of the feedback. But we also asked questions about the principles upon which just transition planning should be made, and this in a sense of this slide. So we gave them a range of options, from sort of a laissez-faire of let businesses get on with it to other options that form the basis of transition. And absolutely the kind of two, kind of most popular and certainly sort of the most important aspects were about using workers' own insights and knowledge of their sectors about how to decarbonise. So that's the second one up from the bottom. And the most kind of one of the most important principles is recognizing that the transition of today is rooted in some of the disadvantages of the transition of the past. And so this connecting of dialogue between workers and communities about that the transition was felt to be really, really important. We're doing more work again in relation to this question of kind of local, thinking about communities and legacies of past transition, on how workers see that kind of the opportunities and indeed challenges of tomorrow. We did ask for some specific comments, and we've got a range of responses. So it's just recognizing, in a sense, these comments were similar for workers in higher carbon and other sectors. So they're not unique to workers in those sectors. But of course, there are those cynics that maybe see the need for change, but really don't think that there's public support for them. Clearly, we have, the emotions that sort of surround this. We've got a bank of questions around sort of hope and fear, guilt, outrage, and sort of sense of emotions towards the kind of climate challenge. And again, whilst these they need to be recognised, but they also need to be thought about in terms of how to speak to these in terms of the kind of strategies and plans that we might take forward with our kind of campaigns. But absolutely, I mean, one of the most interesting comments in a way was people saying, thanks for a really interesting survey. I hadn't thought about these questions, or these things are not being talked about in my workplace. And so we really flag up this kind of scope for much, much more dialogue, both at the workplace and between campaigns. And one final thing that we looked at was we presented a whole range, this is just a selection of them, we presented a whole range of kind of green policy ideas to kind of test who was in favour of them, what are the characteristics of those people that are for and against them. And again, in terms of thinking about union members in general, but also those workers in certain sectors, there's sort of general support, high levels of support for what would be seen to, as some have mentioned previously, what might have been seen as radical proposals maybe 3 or 5 years ago are absolutely not. These are really well supported. And I know we've got other data from other sources that support that, but this comes through in this survey as well. So I'll finish there. I mean, really, that's kind of food for thought in terms of thinking about how best to draw on this kind of data. Is it useful? How would you use it? Would you like us to share it in a slightly different way? And how might you use it to take it back into your campaigns? Or indeed, are there other questions that you think we should be asking of workers, because we're continuing to do this programme of work? Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks a lot. That final slide, I was just trying to sort of grasp the details of that side, but if I'm getting that right, that is very positive, that final slide, in terms of across different sectors, whether it's unionised, not unionised, high carbon, not high carbon, the level of support for the kind of transitions that would reduce our emissions, create jobs, is really high. Is that right to understand it in that way, Jo?
Well, absolutely, because we had another bank of questions which is in a sense would be seen to be more kind of reactionary solutions. They were kind of more market-based solutions of price caps and carbon taxes and so on. But these actually more transformational policies were more appealing.
Which is something I think that for us as activists, that's really important to grasp, and to be as bold and as confident in campaigning on those things as we possibly can be. And this is the time, I think, Jo, your comments about that slide on the cynicism, the climate cynicism, good luck on that. Green policies are too expensive to implement. I think there's definitely the gauze is coming from people's eyes of realizing actually it's the high carbon fossil fuel, oil, gas, etc., that is costing a lot, and it's the alternatives that could be much cheaper for us. We have an opportunity to really push that as well. Right, Jo, thank you so much for that. Let's move on. Mary, we said that we would bring you in next, which I think kind of makes sense. So from a campaigning perspective, and Mary's speaking on behalf of Stop Burning Trees. So then, yeah, I'll let you obviously, but the question of how then do campaigners reach out to workers on this question of transition whilst maintaining absolute integrity in the on the need to campaign very strongly on the false direction that the government are pushing in at this moment in time. Mary, welcome. Off you go.
Thank you. Hiya. So I'm Mary. I campaign with Stop Burning Trees Coalition at Drax, specifically around biomass and Drax. I think it's maybe worth having a little bit of a brief intro to what is going on with biomass and Drax, just so people have that understanding. But it's sort of very much presented, biomass, burning trees for electricity effectively, it's very much presented as the solution to moving away from fossil fuels. And a sort of lots of corporations and governments are presenting it as this sort of opportunity for a just transition and a move into green jobs. That's a narrative that gets pushed very heavily, particularly in Yorkshire, where we're based. And it's a very heavily subsidised industry as well. Last year it received 982.6 million in subsidies. So obviously this is something the government has been putting a lot of support into. And yeah, in the sort of local area, Drax very much presents themselves as providing green jobs to people. They have a lot of ties with, you know, schools, universities, and they spend a lot of time in the local media pushing this. We're bringing green jobs to this area. They wildly overinflate their jobs figures a lot of the time as well, but it nonetheless sort of makes its way into public consciousness around Drax, particularly in Selby. And so I think when you're campaigning against it, we often run into this problem of people saying, well, you want to take our jobs away, and Selby is, you know, an ex-mining area, very heavily scarred when Thatcher closed all the mines down. And so that is still there in public consciousness. And when we're campaigning against Drax, there is this very sort of delicate relationship to manage with the local area and workers at Drax, that we're not actually just trying to come in and take all their jobs away, that there is another alternative, which again means you have to combat this sort of like green capitalism, green biomass narrative around it. So yeah, we have tried to, in some ways, and I think a lot more can be done. That is something we're looking at, to be sort of connecting with workers. We've sort of hit a bit of a dead end with a lot of the unions. The main unions there are Unite and GMB, and that sort of people have been trying that for quite a long time and not really getting anywhere, because unions and like sort of, I guess, the heads of unions are pro biomass, and it is presented as, you know, this green solution that we can move energy workers into. And while we have some contact with ex-workers, that is only a couple of people, and people who currently work at Drax are very anti sort of speaking out about what's going on there. The recent like wildcat strikes have been a little bit of a changing point with that. There's been a few workers sort of talking about the really terrible conditions that they're actually working in, which we hear from ex-workers, but don't necessarily get to hear from workers who are actually currently there. And it's also, I think, well, like the jobs, talking about jobs and just transition and everything is so important in this area, because also like Selby campaigners who have previously campaigned against biomass have faced quite high levels of harassment, because Drax is so heavily embedded in the local economy and sort of the surrounding area as well. So it is also something for campaigners to be very aware of, how delicate this sort of like balance is of, as Suzanne said, maintaining that integrity and maintaining our, you know, views on Drax and how terrible they are for planet and communities abroad, whilst also developing an actual sort of plan for a just transition. Yeah, so I think like currently we're in this process with they're doing a BECS application for bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which again is being presented as this huge jobs opportunity, something that's like wildly overinflated. They're talking about, you know, thousands of new jobs. When you drill down into those figures, it's only 300 long-term jobs, but nonetheless that's making all the headlines. They're pouring millions into advertising that all around the area, and so people are still like buying into that. Yeah, so I think there is like quite a lot of issues that sort of are challenging in this area of campaigning, both, as I said, in terms of you want like people wanting to do actions and that sort of thing, but also not wanting to sort of just put all the workers against us, because for this campaign to be effective, it very much has to be one that brings the workers with us and is also led by them and isn't just damaging that area again. And yeah, I think making those like connections specifically with workers, the like difficulties with the unions is a particular sort of challenge, because they're just sort of not, and there are people within those unions and there are trade councils around the area in Leeds and York and that sort of thing who are happy to be anti-Drax and happy to sort of say what is really going on there with the amount of greenwashing and that sort of thing, but on a sort of wider level, sort of running into a bit of a brick wall there, which yeah makes the whole thing more challenging. And then also, like when we sort of started the Stop Burning Trees coalition and talked about it, it was very clear that members of this coalition wanted to have a sort of plan for a just transition and what that would look like and how we could actually support those workers doing that. So we're very lucky to have lots of wonderful members like Stuart who are looking at all those sorts of things, but that is something that requires a lot of research and also to be sort of, yeah, spoken about in a way that can cut through all of Drax's greenwashing and the sort of way they present themselves as such a huge employer in the local economy. Yeah, so I think there is like this very delicate balance, and it's something I think would actually look like a lot of advice on, and to have that conversation more, because it is something that's so important, and how there are direct action groups involved in the coalition, that sort of thing, and how they can go about doing those actions and that sort of thing without really harming that relationship with workers more. I think I don't have loads to say. I'm sorry, I'm a bit ill today. But I think it would be really great to have anyone's thoughts on that, how we can progress that relationship going forward, how you can actually develop that sort of idea for a just transition, whilst also cutting through the amount of greenwashing, and the way that it's presented as this huge green employer, that so many people unfortunately buy into, if they even have heard of biomass, which is not loads of people either, to be fair. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Mary. And it's good to put those questions out for people to have a think about, share their any campaigning experiences and successes, but for us to keep talking about them. For my 2 pence, I'd definitely say, however, we absolutely need to carry on campaigning, because just sometimes simply by continuing to do that, begins to win some of those debates and arguments, especially in terms of the context that we're existing in at this moment in time, where people can see so much of what they're being told is false and full of lies and benefits only a minority of our society. Okay, fabulous. Thank you, Mary. I'm going to finish up with Stuart, and then after Stuart, we'll be taking some discussion from all of you involved with this workshop. So Stuart, over to you from Wakefield Just Transition.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. It took a little while to get my head around what I've been asked to talk about, which is kind of 2 things: the West Yorkshire Climate Plan and a campaign around that, and also alternative employment that we've started to think about here in West Yorkshire and in Wakefield in particular. So it's kind of in 2 parts, but just to give you a little bit of context, Wakefield district is surrounded on 3 sides by motorways. We've got the A1M and the M1 going north-south, and then the M62 linking them across the top. So we have massively higher proportion of jobs in logistics and warehousing than anywhere else in the country, which, with everything that relates to that, low union membership, insecure employment, 0 hours contracts, and all of that. So that's a little bit of background. But we also have a new mayoral combined authority. The mayor was elected in May, June 2021. So she's been in power or in position, power is probably the wrong word, for comfortably over a year. Her climate plan is coming to its 12-month anniversary, which we've got some work around on October the 21st. The previous combined authority has a separate pre-existing climate plan that's now 3 years old, and obviously the 2 don't necessarily talk to each other. The original combined authority had commissioned a study from Element Energy to look at some carbon emission reductions pathways, but so far none of those 3 suggested pathways have been adopted or acted on. But to give a little bit of context, transport emissions across West Yorkshire in 2020 were 4.9 million tonnes. Buildings emissions were 4.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And together, those 2 make up 85% of West Yorkshire's emissions. So it should be really obvious where we need to focus activity to take the emissions out of the economy and where to put the jobs. So that's a little bit of background. Kind of strategies that we've worked on. Trade unions and the Green Movement together have all called for a Green Jobs Task Force, because the mayor came to election promising 1,000 green jobs / apprenticeships in the first 3 years, which we thought was hopelessly inadequate. That task force does exist. It has 1 trade union seat on it, which is the regional TUC. Bill Adams is stretched very thin because he gets to sit on everything, but there are no trade unions, no trade councils, not even the county association, and no climate campaigners on this Green Jobs Task Force. Everything is focused on business and the LEP, I'm afraid. So that's the reality of what we're facing. So there's kind of a little bit of success there. The mayor has adopted a Fair Work Charter, and that is well supported by regional TUC. So that's a little bit of progress. And she is slowly inching towards bus franchising to get a little bit of local control back over public transport. That's a long, slow process. Better Buses for West Yorkshire, again, well supported by trade unions and the Green Movement, are putting real pressure on there. And so there are some real successes, but the real transport policy is still based on the historic road schemes, which are all focused on increasing capacity at congestion hotspots. They are at best neutral on future emissions, and most of the schemes are really quite carbon negative. And there is barely any retrofit policy on buildings. There's a small scale pilot just announced for Leeds, which I think is funded by the Combined Authority, but that's it. So the West Yorkshire Friends of the Earth groups have been working quite systematically on what we call constructive engagement with the Combined Authority, where we have sent to every Combined Authority board meeting, every climate committee and every transport committee, and now we're starting on the Transport Scrutiny Committee. We send detailed briefings to all committee members with a set of questions, a set of issues, and where there are gaps between policy and action. It's very slow progress. We've also now started running briefings for councillors, and we had a reasonable turnout, but we're getting to the end of what we can do with constructive engagement, because it feels like running a, you know, for teachers among us, it really feels like running a CPD program for councillors at the moment. But the problem seems to be that it takes time to transform the bureaucracy from a traditional combined authority to a mayoral combined authority. Loads of new people been appointed, but the political decision making, the political direction coming through all of those key committees is at best weak, and so there isn't the same direction given to senior officers as you might see in a local authority, and so there is a bit of a policy vacuum and a lack of confidence to act. So things are very slow, but there is always a point of hope. Following the Labour, because we've got 5 Labour authorities and a Labour mayor. So following the Labour Party conference with this whole new greener, fairer Britain policy, we are hoping that the mayor, who is very much a Starmerite, will have to, because she's up for re-election in 2024, have to hook herself onto that national policy framework, and hopefully that will begin to accelerate things. However, that's where we're up to. It's a big network campaign with lots of different groups, and the Green Movement and the trade union movement working hand in hand on some aspects of that. But it is really hard going sometimes. And the relationship between the local authority and the mayoral authority is critical in getting both regional and local climate action moving, because everybody is now absolutely skint. You know, the headline in the Wakefield Express this week is 80 million shortfall, another 80 million shortfall in the local authority budget because of energy costs and just general inflation, and yeah, the next round of austerity. So we've been asking ourselves, out of frustration, what can we do to affect change? What can we do to start to develop the green skills and the green jobs that we know that we need when in the face of deliberate and systematic government inaction? And the answer we've come up with is all of our, or at least some of our local authorities, and particularly Wakefield, has got a community wealth building initiative built into its new economic strategy, which is focusing on what's being called the well-being economy. So it's about the economy delivering for people rather than delivering for GDP figures, really. So we've got an opportunity there, and we can't wait for national government to come up with funding for local authorities, because that's going to take years and a general election. So therefore, we're asking ourselves, can we create with the local authority community co-op initiatives that can start to retrofit homes, that can start to install heat pumps, can start to deliver shared ownership rooftop solar models through the cooperative model, in order to develop those skills locally, so that we're not just sitting and waiting for somebody else to do it, I suppose, to put it crudely. We kind of went, we've started exploring that, partly inspired by stuff going on in Sheffield with Dave, I forget his surname, but partly inspired by that. It is the closest we're going to get to socialism for a very long time. It's going back to the Rochdale pioneers and that cooperative model. It begins to develop the skills, but it is going to be a very slow uphill task. But the beauty of it is that it will engage our communities, and the benefits are there for the communities. So it overcomes some of that resistance that Joe was talking about with Just Transition, and that Mary was talking about at Drax, which is how do we support people and help people in seeing the benefit of green policies, and actually when the benefit is mutual help but mutual financial benefit as well as energy benefit and climate benefit, then hopefully that will fall all into place. But we are right at the beginning of that, and it is not going to be a quick process. We may even find a general election comes first. Who knows? Thank you. Thanks,
Stuart. And it's an interesting place to finish. I'm guessing that the strategy that you identify is not in opposition to a continued campaigning strategy. I feel
in addition to continuing campaigning. Yeah,
okay, absolutely. And then Stuart, can I just ask one other thing? The figures that you mentioned earlier for where the emissions come from, are you able to just quickly repeat those?
Yes, absolutely. They came from the Element Energy study that the Combined Authority commissioned, actually. 4.9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent from transport and 4.5 million tonnes from buildings. And that's collectively 85% of the total emissions. Because we're not a very rural county. Wakefield and Calderdale has little bits of land use emissions, but most of it is well urbanized.
And I think that's a really important point. And it comes back to, notwithstanding, when we talk about high carbon sectors, we are often thinking of particular industrial sectors, but actually, really we really need to drag our sights. And the just transition that is important in those industrial sectors, but there are these huge transitions that need to be made in the things that we take for granted, our transport system and our buildings. We're back to our buildings again.
And these are the transitions that have the biggest impact, biggest positive impact on the communities, and whether those communities are in work or pre-work or retired, post-work, it doesn't really matter. Everybody benefits from cutting transport emissions and boosting public transport, and everybody benefits from retrofitted energy efficient housing.
Thanks, Stuart. And that's important in terms of the arguments within the trade union movement that people have mentioned in the chat, not to ignore the other arguments about specific industries and specific transitions, but they're also important in winning a general position where lots of unions can unite in the question of public transport and in home retrofit.
And it comes back to social justice, again, social and economic justice for every community in the country.
Thanks, Stuart. Okay, right. Again, lots and lots and lots of just questions and areas to explore. I'm going to move now. We've got about 40 minutes, 50 minutes of discussion time. And I'm looking for people to contribute, to ask further questions, to share experiences. We'll give a little bit of time, like, a couple of minutes maybe per speaker, but also feel free to chip in as the discussion develops. So anybody who wants to kick off, Richard, and then Chris. So Richard Chris, and then Cynthia. Richard, I can't hear you. Don't know why. Richard Shires. Yeah. Richard, let me bring in Cynthia and then I'll come back to you. You're not on mute, so it's something to do with volume, I would say.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I know we're talking about people in high carbon industries and so on. I just wanted to share something. I've been on a lot of Zooms, I've listened to a lot of points of view, and I still have an issue that kind of keeps coming back. So I want someone to tell me I'm going off at a tangent. It's rubbish, basically. But underlying everything we're talking about, when we're talking about economics, is we're talking about us as a country. And I think what I feel is that we lose that sense of a oneness in so much. And partly, I think it's because in the background, there is this narrative that says we're the 5th richest country in the world, right? Measuring our GDP. Now, my understanding is, and I'm not an economist as such, but I've taught in, management stuff. GDP is not some kind of sacrosanct thing. And the person who thought it up said, well, this is not really a perfect measurement. Then it suddenly became everything. So, so we take that part of it. The City of London is rolling in money. It seems to me that our country, the City of London, is pretty rich, but the rest of us are not. Some time ago, because I've been a councillor, I was a councillor a while, I'm going back a few years now. So, we were having a conversation in the council. We've got these people who wanted to buy a building and use it for offices and so on. And it wasn't stacking up. The business plan didn't seem to me to stack up. So I said, well, are you going to take on work for other councils in the south? And yes. I said, so we are the offshoring now, aren't we? And he said, yes. And that stayed with me. And I feel like the rest of us are the offshoring, and the City of London sits there making its money and making it for itself. And I feel if we see ourselves in that way and realize we've got this absolutely common, interest in just having a vision, we put that as a sort of base. Can we have a different vision of our society and how we will work together? Probably not doing as much work, because this is so long ago. We don't have to have work. We just have to have everything else that we need. Not necessarily 40 hours a week work. And there's so much in the trade union movement that says if you don't have that, you don't live comfortably. And I don't think it has to be like that. So thank you for letting me ramble, and please would somebody take my comments to pieces.
Thanks, Cynthia. Cynthia, I've heard Cynthia raise the same points earlier, so perhaps do feel free to comment back to Cynthia's points, either in agreement or disagreement or whatever. I'm going to just check. Richard, can I see if you can be heard now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, good. And then also, Chris, did you still want to speak? Okay, let me take Richard.
Sorry, yes, I do want to speak. Thanks.
Okay, so let's do Richard and then Chris, and then we'll go to Teresa, Terry, and to Les. Okay, Richard, over to you.
Okay, my background is I'm a sort of environmental scientist, engineer, and before COVID, I used to do a lot of talks around the UN and climate change, which I've studied for decades and stuff. And the thing that, I'm reading science papers every day around climate and stuff, but the thing that really depresses me is the lack of public engagement around this. And I put on the chat previously about this statistic that really amazed me, that only 13% of the British public get that we're 100% responsible for climate change. One of the things a few decades ago, I was doing a study around stakeholder engagement, whatever. It's this. If you look at you've got the situation around stakeholder engagement, people's ability to actually really get into things and really move on things. It's a question of power, information, and motivation. The problem we've got is that fundamentally, the majority of people have not a clue what is coming down the track. We're talking about exponential consumption growth across globally. And this is really dramatic. When you look at some of the, Jason Hickel talks about it in some of his work. There's a great paper by Korsman, and I sent, Susanna, I sent you just a few slides. Really, there's one slide there on the consumption. And people do not get this. Well, by the time we really start appreciating the impacts, it's too late. It's way, it's always time to do stuff, but it's going to be too late. You have to try to communicate and envision and get across this. This is so fundamental. And you see it I see it in councillors. I see it in like trade unionists or whatever. They just don't get it. And we're not even on the starting blocks. This is the problem. It's the fundamental communication. All this detail that say, Stuart's fantastic, the stuff that he's going on about with Wakefield and stuff, and all these, you're trying to make the arguments, but it's the very fundamental point about what is coming down the track very, very soon. We're going to way exceed 1.5. We're headed to 2. We're headed to almost the complete annihilation of coral reefs and the knock-on impacts and food security. We only can have black swan events around the globe, which could actually really lead in the next 10 years to a massive famine situation. That's quite plausible. So we need to get across the fundamental that this is an exponential trajectory that we're potentially on. And that really creates the motivation for people to really want to sort of dig into this and see what the hell we can do. That's, I could go on and on, but that's enough. Okay, sorry about that.
No, thank you, Richard. Let me not comment because let me bring some other people in. Chris, and then Teresa, and then Les. Sorry, Chris.
Hiya. Yes, my point is one of the difficulties, I suppose, going again on communication, is that we're surrounded by propaganda which is passed off as objective evidence about climate change. So we sort of know that the government is making up how expanding the fossil fuel industry and heavy industries will solve climate change as long as we do enough of it. But also bodies like the Climate Change Committee are obliged in their terms of reference to show how we can fight climate change at the same time as achieving economic growth. So you get these absurdly speculative, bordering on the preposterous solutions that you roll out technologies like carbon capture and storage, which can't capture all the carbon, so inevitably will lead to residual emissions. You'll be left with some emissions in 2050 and way beyond that, because that's the life of the plant that you're building. And the way you offset that is apparently, two of the main ones are burning biomass in power stations and directly capturing carbon from the air, which has never proven to work in practice. To work in a useful way, I should say. So we're surrounded by this, and high carbon workers, if they start to look at the issues, we'll see all this. It's the, but we not only need an alternative, but we also need to show that if you go along with those sorts of solutions, we're actually going to get emissions that are way beyond catastrophic levels. I mean, another point that I had to drag out of the Climate Change Committee that I've never heard mentioned in an academic report, is that they virtually admitted that they are when they do their computer models, they show that they our manufacturing sector continuing to contract, which means that you get less emissions based, just on the basis of scale. Whereas actually there's a plan to massively expand the high carbon sector to, to get more steel and concrete and all these things, so that you can actually build all this apparently low carbon kit that's supposed to solve the problem. So yeah, things like the climate jobs reports are very good, but also I think we need to start challenging the information that surrounds us, at the sort of academic, business and political level. So it needs a bit of research, but I think that's something that has to be a big part of our plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Terry?
Thanks, Suzanne. Yes, I've got my Sunday name up again. Yeah, I'll get to the reason I put my hand up eventually, but I just wanted to respond to what Richard said and what some people have said in response in the chat, because I don't agree, for example, that the work that Stuart talked about in terms of detail from Wakefield is unimportant. And I certainly thought that the information that Jo's slides provided, or Jo's research as condensed in her slides, was actually very optimistic and shows that I think results from surveys and results from both quantitative and qualitative research very much vary according to the way they're posed. And I thought that the way that those final questions were posed in very positive terms, these are things we could change relatively easily, that are concepts that make sense to you, was very positive. And I think we do need to link up general information and material about the impacts of climate change. And I don't disagree with Richard that we're in a desperately awful situation with things that people can get involved in and can get involved in collectively, because I think we need to be appealing to people as communities, as trade unionists, as campaigners, and not just as individual, isolated, atomized and terrified people, because otherwise we won't be able to move things forward. What I wanted to come in on is the situation that Suzanne referred to in response to somebody's contribution. I can't remember whose, in terms of the trade unions, particularly aimed at, because I know Scot E3 have been doing some sterling work around this, but we need to, I think, be looking at what are the levers that we have amongst workers who are working or have worked in high carbon sectors. I was part of a fight in an old union, MSF, many years ago to get the union to commit to opposing nuclear energy. And for years, the whole question of the workers in those plants, in that industry, was used as a cudgel to beat the rest of us down. You're just trendy liberals, you don't know what it's like, and so on. And it does seem to me that in a situation where the big unions are really blocking these discussions, I'm active in Unite, and there are real problems about, despite the fact it's supposed to have a climate strategy, it's really hard to get beyond the music, the voices, or the supposed voices. I'm not sure they actually are the voices of the workers on the ground, to shut the rest of us up. So I think we really need to be thinking about how we amplify the voices of workers in the industries on the high carbon industries to assist the rest of us, and where our strengths and weaknesses are now and what we can do to change the balance. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. Yeah, thank you very much. Les, and then Nikki, and then Debbie.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I'd like to focus on workers in high carbon sectors, which I think illustrates a much bigger issue about how knowledge relates to action or inaction or passivity. And there's a prevalent view across the left, unfortunately, that people's deficient knowledge explains why they don't protest or act effectively. But I think the relationship is sometimes the other way around. If people see a way to gain collective agency, then they want to know more in order to clarify how to act collectively. And that seems to be the case with the workers in high energy sectors. I mean, as Pete explained, their leadership, at least, is in a cross-class alliance, which inherently prevents any independent working class action on low carbon transition. And the survey was interesting in a kind of shift, because the initial questions were implicitly asking these workers, what do you think will happen to you? You know, as simply objects of forces beyond their control. But then the latter questions implicitly ask, would you like to influence what happens, and not just to you, but by you? And so that has some grounds for optimism, but the question remains, I mean, how can at least some of those workers find a way to develop collective agency, or whatever it should be called, social agency for acting collectively to undermine this cross-class alliance through alternative proposals? I don't know enough to answer that question, but that seems to be central to generating the relevant knowledge, or spreading the knowledge that already exists, because they need an incentive to want to know and to want to imagine a different society, which with provides some livelihoods and basic public services, amenities, but without this perpetual increase in energy usage and carbon emissions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Les. People are posing lots of questions, and I've been very humble, as in suggesting that they're not able, that they can't answer all of these questions. I wonder whether our contributors at the start of the session would think about answering some of the questions that have been raised, either now or later. But meanwhile, I will move to Nikki and then to Debbie, and then to hear you after that.
Yeah, hi. I've sort of come to this thing from many different places, but actually in terms of what I've been involved in, so I have been involved in, or am involved in, taking on the aviation industry specifically. But in terms of the conversation, I probably am really just going to echo what's been said already. But I do think, well, several things. The current cost of living crisis is creating something in terms of solidarity. I mean, it's hopefully not going to fizzle out, and it's hopefully going to build. But I don't feel that the sort of environmental kind of connections with that are sort of in place. And part of the problem is because they're not presented like that in the media. The discussions that have on mainstream media present the public with choices to deal with the current situation that are so narrow and don't actually, I'll not go into all the details because I'm sure everyone knows that. But I just, speaking as an individual in terms of reaching other people, I've spent a lot of time handing leaflets out on high streets and ending up thinking, I shouldn't be having to do this. This is just like, in a way, such an ineffective way of reaching people. because I basically just think our media is such a spectacular failure, our mainstream media, in terms of information. And I don't really know, I'm going to be another person that says I don't really know how we go about changing that. But I agree with the last speaker entirely that, you know, this is about information, and it really is about information. People are deprived of information. Unless you go looking for it, you're not going to find it. And the other, so there's that, the media. It's a question how we deal with that. And the other thing really is my fear that there's a potential for divisions between workers being swung by the idea of growth under any circumstances, and between the sort of the thinking which is really more about looking at what these GDP figures are all about in the first place. I mean, they don't actually reflect industrial production anyway, as I understand it, because every bit of money that is earned through capital gains is added on to our GDP figures. So they're not, it's a very murky world, but I just think those are huge issues. But in challenging them, we have to spread the information, and we have to find a way of doing that that's really effective. And I do think that the cost of living crisis is a potential way to do that if we can make the inroads into the trade unions, really, who the groups that actually are going to be in a position to spread information much more effectively, certainly than my little group that's about fighting aviation expansion. I don't think I've been very clear because it's all so many complicated things, but that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, Nikki, I think you were clear, absolutely. And one message that comes across from I think it's the purpose of today, but it's obviously, it remains a challenge, is how do we popularize and amplify the solutions? Because I actually think there's much greater support than maybe. Terry made the point earlier in terms of picking up on Joe's slides. There's perhaps greater support for some things that we're campaigning for, but how do we popularise and amplify them both within the trade union movement and more broadly? So it's a counter narrative to the failure of our mainstream media, which is very much what Nikki and others have commented on. Okay, it's 12:28. We will finish by 12:45. I've got 3 speakers indicating, which will bring us quite close to that. So I'm going to ask also for the other speakers who are introduced to be ready to make any final comments, and I will see if there's anybody else who wants to speak. But bear in mind, it will have to be shorter contributions if I'm to get a bunch of extra speakers in. So Debbie, and then Tahir.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be terribly clear either, but, you know, people have talked about workers being deprived of information. I think people are also deprived of vision. I mean, both the government and the opposition are ranting on about growth. And, you know, it comes down to what sort of world do we want, it seems to me. And so I'm off the topic of high carbon workers, but, you know, all this GDP growth for what? To have more stuff? And, you know, Keynes himself, I think it was, said, you know, GDP is anything. You can send people out to dig holes and then fill them in, and then dig them again and then fill them in. And that all adds up the money because it only measures quantity, not quality. And Stuart kindly came to our climate jobs session in York, and we had a speaker from the Women's Budget Group talking about feminist Green New Deal and saying, you know, you can decarbonize all you like, but then you'll end up with a sort of green extractivism that goes on, you know, business as usual, but green. And so I think, you know, they were arguing more in terms of, you know, public services and better quality of life and well-being. And those many public sector jobs like health and care per capita are relatively low carbon and also important. And I'm not sure, sorry for going a bit off topic, but basically what sort of vision are we looking at?
Thanks, Debbie. Tahir next.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Firstly, I was grateful that Nikki came in, because I was originally going to contribute on the aviation sector and say, and I still will say, that in fact in that area there's quite a well-developed anti-expansion network that reaches into both unions and into climate activists, and provides a model for others to follow, really. But the point I did want to come in on here is the kind of polarisation within the trade union movement at the moment in terms of climate issues. Now, I think obviously, it's not just as simple as a kind of membership leadership split, because there are plenty of members who are worried about their jobs or who've absorbed stories from the media and so on. But it's the leaderships that are, of certain unions anyway, that are reluctant to embrace climate policies because they don't want to be seen to be what they might perceive as selling their members down the river. I mean, my argument has been the exact opposite of that, actually, that if you really think about it, and I think Richard was kind of making these points about, the imminence of catastrophe, we are going to come to a point where we can't, you'd say we are at that point, but where we literally can't dig anything else out of the ground, we literally can't let another aeroplane take off, etc., etc. What's going to happen to those members' jobs when we get to that point is something that I've tended to pose as an argument for unions to come to the table and start talking about, well, what are we going to do with the workforce of the future? What are we going to do about transition, and what happens? Of course, it ends up being very antagonistic. I mean, and conflictual. The reaction tends to be the kind of rhetoric that we see coming out of GMB, which the policies that seem to be completely opposed to any kind of climate initiatives at all. In fact, almost coincide with Tory policy as it currently stands, which just seems ridiculous. So how do we actually engage with those? I mean, we've got a session on it this afternoon, unpack it a bit more, but I've come to the conclusion, really, you can't just you've got to get these people on board to have that conversation. So maybe, part of the answer is just to say, well, okay, you have these policies in favour of fracking and airport expansion and that. Let's not even talk about that. You still need to come to the table, recognise reality. It's a growing recognition amongst a significant chunk of the population that we're not going to be able to do these things forever. Just come, whatever your policies are, just come to the table and have this conversation about what the workforce in the future will look like. Maybe that's a kind of, maybe it's a bit more inviting, really, than trying to kind of, oppose their policies, because they'll only retrench and dig in and be more committed to those things. But there is a really key issue there about what the lifespan of those jobs is if we carry on the track we're on. And of course, if they are successful in supporting the expansion of those industries, you're just bringing forward that day. You bring forward the day of your own redundancy, in a sense. So it's a conversation that needs to be had urgently. And I look forward to hearing from people this afternoon on those sort of subjects.
Thanks, Tahir. Yeah, it's an important debate. I tend to think that some people have already retrenched when they use language like bourgeois environmentalists. It's just a kind of failure to even engage with the climate crisis. But anyway, we to be continued, definitely a discussion to be continued. Joe, you disappeared from my screen. Not sure why. Yeah, I was going to bring you in next, Joe.
Oh, so yeah, sorry, I took my hand down, but yeah, just a couple of things. I think people have absolutely articulated. One of the things I wanted to say is about this kind of alternative vision for the future. Maybe that's something for discussion. Maybe I'm a ridiculous optimist, but I think it's an important part of the conversation to think about as I say, my research is about just transition, and a lot of the discussion is about the justice, but we haven't talked a lot about, or I think there's more to say about transition to what. So perhaps that's part of this. There's a whole range of speakers have talked about this sort of how do we communicate that vision rather than just being seen to be anti, hey, let's say we're the anti-growth coalition. On that point, I think that there is something really fundamental to be thinking about, particularly for trade union colleagues, about the kinds of demands that unions have historically made, have been absolutely rooted in a sense, the redistribution of the profits from growth. And so there's something really fundamental that needs to change, I think, in terms of what we would suggest are alternative demands. And the final point that I wanted to make, which is also perhaps for discussion this afternoon, is that one of the bits of our survey asked people whether they were kind of active on climate issues at work, in their community, at home. And obviously, again, we can't judge on the quality or nature or effectiveness of those engagements, but it sort of, the results gave us in a sense, reinforced the point that people are active in their communities, but might maybe not take themselves to work, if you see what I mean, that they might not take their concern for the environment in their daily life, or when they talk to their kids, or if they're, doing stuff in other settings. How can we work at a community level to encourage people to think about how they need to take that boat back, both to their workplaces, as a conversation with co-workers, as a conversation with management, and indeed a union if it exists in their workplace. So there was just some reflections on the discussion, really rich, and look forward to taking it forward this afternoon in terms of things we can do.
Thanks, Jo. Stuart, Pete, you've indicated. Mary, would you just let me know either in the chat or by putting your hand up if you want to also add something in as we come to a conclusion? Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. It's such a wide-ranging discussion. I've made lots of notes, but I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to say. In terms of trade union and structures and leadership and grassroots, my feeling is from trade union movement in West Yorkshire that the grassroots get it and the trade councils get it, and there are mechanisms, and we certainly use those mechanisms to some extent through regional TUC and the Trades Council's National Conference to push motions up. And they don't have to be negative critical motions. They can be quite positively phrased motions that will still get voted through. So, for example, at Yorkshire and Humber Regional TUC, a motion was passed that recognised the unsustainability of some of the industrial strategies that are being applied in Yorkshire and the Humber. So, and if that had been phrased differently, it wouldn't have got through, because the GMB would have said, "Whoa, hang on, we can't support that. That's our members' jobs." It's about phrasing and so on. So there are mechanisms, but it's not fast. I think the other thing, Assad has talked repeatedly for a couple of years about a movement of movements, and the things that we do on a weekly basis. So, for example, taking the environmental links and messages to the picket lines. So we have a banner, it's just on the back of the sofa here, that says transport jobs equals climate jobs. It's really simple. You take that to the RMT picket line, everybody gets it. You cannot have the transition without decent public transport. And so it starts a conversation, and it helps to build those lines. And we go to each other's rallies. When there's there was a fuel poverty rally in Leeds last week, we just have to make sure that we speak so that we make those connections to at least those people. But even then, to come back to what other people were saying, what Richard and Chris were saying, that we still have to do a lot of climate outreach with the general public as well, which is what we tend to do. So we will go out into the precinct or into the shopping centre, and if there's an event on, and we will just talk to people, people who don't have access to picket lines and trade unions and things, who that ordinary mass of people that we seem to stress about not understanding it. So that's the other thing. In terms of vision, we've got the Climate Jobs book, which provides a real solid core for a vision, and it basically aligns with the Green New Deal. I think the vision is there. Maybe it needs developing, but Joe's right that it's how we then talk about that transition and use the vision that we have developed and are developing to make that conversation that isn't just about the justice, but is about the transition, so that it gives people a positive role. Actually, I can see myself in that kind of work. I can see myself in that kind of work. Yes, you know, and I'm going to say, just to finish, and I will shut up, we do still need to do a lot more detailed work. The stuff that we're doing with Drax, you know, there is a constant countering of greenwash narratives that we just have to keep on doing. We don't really have an option, and it is slow, but we still have to do it. But yeah, just if you haven't recently, just refresh yourself with George Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant, which is all about how, you know, the left typically says we need policy, we need information, and the right win on stories and narrative. And we've got to learn from that, and we've got to get the story and the narrative right. And that's why I find that waving the climate jobs book at people in meetings like this is just so powerful. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And you might want to put a link in the chat to the climate jobs booklet, as opposed to waving it, just in case anybody here hasn't had an opportunity to have a look at it. Pete, would you like to just say a couple of final comments?
Yeah, just very quickly. I guess this is partly in response to Les's question, and also to what Asad Raymond said at the beginning about building power. I mean, I think when it comes to shifting the position that it's all about jobs, I mean, it's never been really true, because actually when you look at, you know, the sectors in which that argument is made, the track record is dismal. Jobs have declined, but if you assume that you're stuck in the status quo, you can see why people would be attracted to that argument. I mean, the one thing that's clear about where we are just now is that things are fantastically volatile. It's not clear what's going to happen over the next few months and years, but as Asad said, we're in a set of intersecting crises. And the really important thing is that people are beginning to move and fight and agitate over these things. And I think it's there that the potential for change exists. And one of the really important things I think about this context is that, you know, for perhaps a couple of decades, most political action has been around social movements that have, you know, around anti-racism and feminism and other issues. And I think we've got to bring that spirit and bring a really critical approach to understanding what's necessary for transition into the kind of class actions that are taking place just now in you know, to protect people's kind of conditions. And just to conclude, I mean, thinking about oil and gas workers, I mean, it is really remarkable that in a situation where oil and gas companies are making enormous profits, most people working offshore now are working effectively on below the minimum wage when you take the number of hours they are offshore. And there's been little glimpses of unofficial action that have taken place, which have been really important. But I think the critical thing that's going to have to happen is that people who work in these carbon intensive industries live side by side with others who are taking action over, over railway workers. They have children who may well be involved in Fridays for the Future. And I think actually kind of this kind of intersection of ideas is really important. And part of our job as climate activists, I think, and trade unionists, is to make this as open and explicit as we possibly can and be as sharp as we can about the arguments. I've been surprised that many climate activists who actually didn't know that much about the gas industry, thought that actually most of our gas came from Russia in ships or something, when in fact virtually all of our gas comes from the North Sea in pipelines, and you can't move pipelines around very easily. You know, that it's a fixed kind of asset. And you know, the government lies about this, the media doesn't tell us, give us clarity about this. So I think it's our job to inject this in, the links between the oil and gas industry and the cost of living crisis and the rotten conditions that people work under. People think that people who work in the oil industry are basically having it fairly cushy. I spend about half my time now in a small town in the northeast of Scotland, where there's queues around the block for the free food cooperative. You know, it looks like a prosperous town. It kind of had some, you know, some benefits from the expansion of the oil industry in the area, but actually the bulk of people, you know, big minority, possibly majority of people now are struggling to survive, and that includes many people whose living has been related to that industry. So we're in a really unusual time, and I think our ambitions have to just be really high, and we have to have those visions and narratives that, but also a precision about the technical things, so that we can't be fobbed off by it's all about Ukraine or it's all about this or that. We need to be sharp on those things and inform each other. You know, we can't all of us be experts on everything, but we can lean on each other to make sure that we can do know what's going on.
Brilliant, thanks, Pete. It's a great place for us to start to bring it to a conclusion. Mary, I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, if that's okay, and then we can finish and have a little bit of time before the next set of workshops. So Mary, over to you.
I'll be super quick. I think I'm just going to echo a lot of what everyone else has said, but yeah, I think those are like really great contributions, and I think it all just sort of stresses the need for like a diversity of tactics and coalition and movement building amongst sort of groups who have aligned interests but often like not clearly aligned. And I think also having the sort of detail of where we can go, having the positive vision that's easily and simply articulated, but then you can actually drill down into the detail, makes a world of difference. For like biomass campaigning, I think we're at quite a critical juncture at the moment, where the sort of mainstream media is in the last week or so sort of reassessed its general view on DRAX and biomass, which makes the sort of ability to articulate a different vision that sort of opened up a small little gap for us, for jobs, workers, energy, and everything like that. So it's an exciting time, but it's also a time to really be working out what these positive visions can actually look like, how that would work, and as Joe and Stuart were saying, the actual like transition, how that would work in practice, rather than just sort of, we know it could, but how that actually happens. But yeah, this was really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to shut up.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks. Okay, great place for us to finish, and just gonna remind people what happens next. So lots of discussion, still lots of questions. I think Anne in the chat mentioned earlier the two bubbles, but I wonder whether the gap between the two bubbles is quite as big as we think it is, and perhaps we're on the verge of some tipping points that can bring those two bubbles together. The demand for them with the solutions that we really know are going to make a difference. This afternoon, kind of continuation of some of the discussions that have started here. The sessions start at 1:30. I will just press that if I can. No, I can't. Sorry. The sessions start at 1:30. And the two sessions, winning urgent climate arguments and trade unions. I hope I said 1:30. Sorry if I didn't. It's definitely 1:30. Building local alliances and getting local councils to act. Those sessions run through till 3 o'clock, and then there's a final final plenary from 3 till 4 after a 5-minute break. You just either stay logged on or log on to the with the same link that you had this morning, and then you'll be allocated. You'll either stay in that room for the workshop you want to be in, or you'll be allocated to a breakout room. So hopefully there are no more questions. Yeah. Okay, all right. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Pete, to Mary, to Joe, and to Stuart. And yeah, we'll see you hopefully all this afternoon or in an hour and a bit. No, in 3/4 of an hour's time, 3/4 of an hour, an hour and a bit.